Hello. In this lecture, I shall be discussing what schizophrenia is. I've been studying psychiatry intently for about 7 years now, and with considerable insight, I've made considerable advances into the nature, causes, treatment, and nosology of schizophrenia, the diagnosis of schizophrenia. Let's differentiate it. First of all, it's classically defined by its four features: hallucinations, delusions, marked social withdrawal, thought disorder. Now, sometimes you find people without a thought disorder or profound hallucinations or that sort of thing, but usually it's marked by three or the four, and usually they're fairly distinct, like they're not just like neurosis, like just partially self-evident. So working from that, I wish to say now, to elucidate my primary theory, is that schizophrenia is fundamentally two things when it should be three. And this is not unlike the three equations that define quantum field theory, in which the Feynman path integral, path independence, and the uncertainty principle are the three principles that define all of quantum mechanics and quantum field theory, all like the Compton experiment, the photoelectric effect, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, and wave particle duality, and the diffraction slit, two slit experiment. So what I wish to say is that schizophrenia is two things seen as three. In other words, normal people process things in threes. Schizophrenics process them in twos. And it's important to differentiate at this stage what I mean by process. What I mean by that is they respond in twos. They sense things in threes. A lot of psychiatrists will tell you that schizophrenia is a perceptual disorder. It's really not a perceptual disorder. It's important to differentiate at this stage because a lot of people will tell you that, oh, people see things abnormally or have a warped sense of reality. That's not really what schizophrenia is, and this is evidenced by the fact that you seldom see truly bizarre, out of range delusions evidence from schizophrenics. They're usually religiously tied, like just sort of loosely fanatical, but not really just so bizarre as to have no origin at all. And so, other things is that um, I guess some psychiatrists will tell you it's a functional disorder, in which case you'd say like maybe the brain is only working 90% of the time, or 10% of the neurons are failing, or there's information lossiness in 1% of the neuron firings. And it's been shown through neurological studies, like logic studies, that even a 1 in 1 billion error in neural coding leads to failure of the system overall, meaning that the error in neural cognition grows so exponentially that after about half an hour, you'd have someone who was so psychotic they'd pass for retarded. So that evidence is out. I'm not sure which works to quote for that theory, but I've seen it in books before, and I can probably derive it myself if I really sat down and thought about it. Uh, Two things seen as three. It basically means that normal people are exposed to physics like light, momentum, force, potential energy, kinetic energy. All these things are three-dimensional. In a sense, there's an XYZ component. To use math and physics more richly, they have three elements or dimensions. And even if you switch coordinates, often you can't get rid of all the coordinates, even like in Lagrangians and Hamiltonians. If you form a coordinate, change the coordinates, turn a circular orbit into a two-dimensional problem because it's planar, a lot of times you'll still be stuck with a third dimension in case of friction or something. So it's important to delineate what I mean by twos and threes, and that's really all schizophrenia is. The reason why this is so unifying is because you can derive all the facets and features of schizophrenia from this simple principle. Derive it in the sense that it is logical, consistent, defined, reasonable, integrated, um, reproducible, can be seen by different people to be logically consistent, reproducible, consistent, integrated, non-contradictory, and aesthetic even. So I don't want to go through the whole derivation of all the properties of schizophrenia, but we'll go over a few, like, for instance, hallucinations. Hallucination is just someone dreaming out loud. It's basically the same thing as sleep deprivation, in which case a person experiences hallucinations because their brain is fatigued and not getting enough rest, in the sense that it's overworked because the neurons are making synaptic connections which trying to respond in ways which are unrealistic or incomplete, leading to a model which is inconsistent with reality, or inconsistent with what would be called, I say the way psychiatrists use the word reality is a bit broad, because most physicists don't even know what reality is. But let's just say it's a physical sensation defined as realistically, physically integrated and perceptual, in the sense that they respond to the percepts. They sense it in threes, but they respond in twos. And you see what I'm saying? That you can derive all the principles of schizophrenia from this. The reason why their eyes usually look so differentiated is because their eyes can only fluctuate responsively in 2 dimensions instead of three. That's why they're usually cross-eyed or wall-eyed or have unusual eyes. And it's also the reason why they stare, and it's the reason why they hallucinate, and it's the reason why they have a thought disorder. Basically, what's happening is the mind is trying to fashion a three-dimensional model using two-dimensional sensations. There's a lot of distortion in that kind of thing. I don't mean perceptual distortion. I just mean the response gets lost in the meantime. So that's basically all schizophrenia is two things seen as three. I first discovered this in 2013 when I realized that schizophrenia was actually 8 disorders. And you would say, well, how does he know it's 8 disorders? He just said it was two things seen as three. You should think of it as three coordinate axes breaking space into 8 dimensions, or 8 quadrants, or octants rather, in which case you have a 8 dimensional disease that's perpetuated by a threefold symmetry with an upper and a lower bound per each, a left and a right side. This should be seen as excess and deficit in terms of the three things schizophrenia fundamentally is. It's more genetics at that stage than anything else. I guess you could say that the 8 disorders, incidentally, are a not a hearing disorder, a heart disorder, a cardiovascular disorder, a sex disorder, an eating disorder, and a sleeping disorder. And the corresponding parasympathetic responses comprise the other 4 diseases that it is. So there's 4 sympathetic and 4 parasympathetic diseases. 2 sleeping disorders, 2 eating disorders, 2 sex disorders, and 2 cardiopulmonary disorders. For a long time, I had thought that it might also include an ear and eye disorder, but the fact that most schizophrenics, at least a good part of them, don't hallucinate, just tends to cast that out. Besides, after a while, I began to realize it was mainly a attachment disorder. It modeled so much after an attachment disorder, I had to define it as being composed of sympathetic and parasympathetic parts. That's partially how I pieced together the model to begin with, is that I just considered it, what if it were multiple things? And then I said, what things does it comprise? And I realized, well, most schizophrenics don't sleep well, they don't eat well, they don't have normal sex drives, and they usually die of heart disease when they're not suicidal. And admittedly, that last thing is a bit misleading because they all smoke anyway. But if you think imaginatively, it's just those 4 things. That's how I batched it together. At the time, I was thinking of modeling schizophrenia as deviations from a curve in 3 dimensional space. And I'm beginning to ask myself, how can you define improper behavior? Is it just the complement of the curve, like all space except the curve? Is it anything in the tangent plane of the curve? the cotangent plane of the curve. And the more I begin to realize that you could define schizophrenia as three-dimensional in the sense that it is everywhere disorganized. They never get it right. And what I began to realize was that the simplest way to model this was to assume that it was a two-dimensional curve trying to imitate a three-dimensional curve. That's the easiest way to model it. There are other methods that might work, like complementary spaces. This is defining someone's behavior as an entire set of behaviors is a bit sporadic. Even if you use something like quantum mechanics or quantum field theory, canceling out all the negative signs is a bit laborious. So it's easier just to assume that it's um, two things trying to be three things. It really should make me famous for medicine. I would expect to win the Nobel Prize for this discovery. It's the most profoundly romantic and advanced thing ever advanced about schizophrenia. Um, at the time, my discovery that was A disordered was the most advanced thing that had ever been discovered about it. But this is quite a bit more radical because it leads to different therapeutic approaches to schizophrenia, such as, um, for instance, the dialectic behavior method is basically a two-dimensional. People will tell you the dialectic is actually three-dimensional because it involves synthesis of opposites. And that's the whole genius behind it, is that it's actually just two things, opposite and forward proposition, canceling each other out. It's why they like it so much. It conforms to their state of mind. Again, I offer that as proof that it is indeed just two things seen as three things. If you really get into it, you can think about codons being three-dimensional and the parasympathetic and sympathetic functions of the human body being grouped into sets and being triggered by a single malfunction. It's an easier way to think of it. The codons in threes, they trigger badly. So once again, two things, sympathetic and parasympathetic, and three-dimensional codon leads to eight disorders. That's one way of proving that schizophrenia is eight disorders. The other methods I have are ingenious. One is schizophrenics like to be levitated in water that is 8 degrees of symmetry, like a top, a bottom, a left, a right, and a height and a depth, like eight symmetries. Another way of proving it is that you can notice that the Rorschach test is essentially just a three-dimensional object taken symmetrically, which means eight symmetries again. Another way of proving it, which is even more ingenious, is seeing it as an attachment disorder and just reasoning that if it is an attachment disorder, it's holistic, meaning that it has to be three-dimensional. Therefore, 2 into 3 is 8. 2 to the third is 8. I know these arguments may seem a bit sporadic. It is a facet of my genius that I can see modeling this clearly. A lot of people would say, aren't there a ton of things to take into consideration when considering schizophrenic suspended in water? Aren't there normal modes of vibration? Is not the fluid six-dimensional or nine-dimensional, as most physicists will tell you? And don't you have to account for subharmonics and sub-subharmonics, an entire wave space of equilibrium states? We really shouldn't make it so complicated. You can argue things like that, but the fact is they're not simple enough, and biology is by no means a complex subject. Yeah, I mean, it is in the sense that organic chemistry and biochemistry is a little bit complex, but I mean, if you think about the governing laws, it's really just physics, and if you understand how few laws there are in physics, there's Newton's laws, the Maxwell the Maxwell tensor law, that's only one law in tensor form, the quantum field theory law, the strong force law, and the gravitational law. That's only about 6 equations. So it's really not that complex. So there's no reason to ask psychiatry and the resultant psychology of deviance and even psychology itself to be that complex. Indeed, I've worked up an entire theory of normal psychology based on threes, because Sigmund Freud said there was the id, the ego, and the superego. In the Oedipus complex, there's mother, father, and society. And also there's the anal, the genital, and the oral stage. So he divides things into threes anyway. And we really shouldn't take that as coincidence that they're in threes. You should just experiment for yourself now as to what it means to know that something is two seen as three. Because it might actually work to attempt to use electronics like electroshock, like trem, or vibrational pads to wave gain two-dimensional vibrations, two-mode vibrations into three-mode vibrations. With a method that ingenious, you wouldn't even have to use painful electroshocks. They're just ordinary microcurrents would do the trick, or micro vibrations. If you knew how to tune properly for the human body, like the inner electron mean kinetic free energy or mean kinetic speed per electron within the human body times the mass, divided by the mass rather, you get the density, or the volume rather, or something of that order. And you could get a fairly consistent result for effective vibrations, which would effectively cure the person without even the use of psychotropic medication. Indeed, I don't think this has ever really been tried. They don't know the frequencies to use. I don't think they would have to be excessively fast. I think you might have to adjust it for things like the calendar and the weather, their mood, what if they're just taking a shower, the temperature of the room. Might have to adjust it a little for things like that, but it should be fairly universal for a patient once you get the basic numbers down. So there's therapeutic methods like that. Indeed, there's even therapeutic methods you can use with schizophrenics, which include elementary things like using two therapists at the same time instead of one. Sometimes it even works to have three therapists. So you can think of things like that. Also, you begin to realize that schizophrenics malfunction in threes and they do things correctly in twos. And so, let's say a schizophrenic is having a problem, like a mental breakdown in one category, then you would know instantaneously that he was having a mental breakdown in two other categories as well. So that's the insight that this model provides us. And all this is a bit of an outline because I've done a good 4,000 pages of work with 40 different kinds of therapy involving each method of schizophrenia applied to each different kind of therapy, like the cognitive theory of two seen as three, for example, basically includes thought processes and cognitive processes that involve twos in breaking into threes, where we try to normalize the patient into a comfortable state of twos and then expand it into threes. For instance, looking at certain kinds of artwork on a cell phone might invariably have that proper effect, or playing video games of a certain kind, and that sort of thing. Um, I guess what I would also say as a caveat is it's important to follow up on all your insight into your assertions about what psychiatry is and isn't, because a lot of times if you assume something like schizophrenia is perceptual, you'll be led to a lot of improper conclusions. And that's why people are usually so judgmental of schizophrenics, is because they just assume they're always wrong. And being wrong is one thing, but being misperceptually aligned is another thing. It's something they clearly aren't. Which is not to say that it isn't debilitating. Not being able to respond properly is debilitating. In fact, it's humiliating. So, I mean, there's a lot of stuff to be said for that kind of thing, too, about the amount of repression that goes on. And most Freudian analysts will tell you that schizophrenics have a very much underdeveloped superego, I believe it is, or maybe it's the ego. I forget which one it is, but I think it's the ego, actually. Their ego is of the three facets, the id, the ego, and the superego. The ego is usually very much underdeveloped, so they seem very needy and very animalistic, like primitive and self-assertive. It's basically the way they keep protesting medication and that sort of thing. And I really don't believe medication is the trend of the future. I believe that vibrational pads, kind of what Tesla would have imagined for humanities when he said that the person that introduces threes into humanities will make great strides, threes, sixes, and nines. And also he said that the person that introduces science into the humanities will make great strides. That's basically all my theory of schizophrenia is a theory of physics. So you can apply a lot of physics into the maelstrom of schizophrenia. You can ask yourself like what Freudian drag is. Like if you were to extrapolate a state from a 9-dimensional tensor into an 8-dimensional disease form, what the lost vector would mean, lost term would mean, and what the rate of loss of information is. And it leads to fascinating new results. Like, for instance, it's kind of like schizophrenia is kind of like IQ. You can actually fashion a single number that expresses a person's degree of health. It doesn't take multiple numbers to describe it, ironically. There's a single number that differentiates whether someone's healthier than someone else. And that's very easy to do. And it's important to have that number at all times. Refer to the patient by it. It's very indicative of the kind of state of mind they're in. And I had spent a lot of time arguing with psychiatrists about the nature of this sort of thing, about medication and nosology and diagnostics and need for intervention. That sort of thing is falling by the wayside. With the new therapies I envision, there won't be much need for medication. There also won't be much need for maybe even therapy if the oscillators can work properly. I don't know if you've ever studied electrical engineering, but there's something called gain in electrical engineering where you can align one wave with another wave. And if you put them close enough together at the right amplitude, relative amplitude, you can get one to lead into the other, to feed into the other, to actually attenuate it, make it bigger. So there's things like that to consider where you could actually patiently and passively coax a person into thinking healthily again in 3 dimensions instead of 2 dimensions. And I mean not perceptually perceiving things, but responding 3 dimensionally. Because a lot of times what happens with schizophrenics is they bottleneck their behavior. It becomes entirely 2 dimensional. Well, the problem with 2 dimensions is that there's a forward and a back state. So you can say yes, but you also have to say no. This leads to a neutral state if you add the two together, and that's simply not the way healthy biology works. Healthy biology is usually polarized. In other words, you can have a yes and 2 no's or a no and 2 yeses. That way, if the person is incorrect, they have a way to back frame and back work and recapture the original effect. Schizophrenics lose this because once they reach the zero state, they've got nothing to refer to. That's another reason my theory works so elegantly. And I've extrapolated this method to include quantum gravity, quantum mechanics, general relativity, special relativity, and other effects in physics. So I modeled things like modeling normal behavior as 3 circles on a sphere and trying to find the arrangement of circles on the sphere that lead to maximum coverage, kind of like global positioning. I found that you can split the different diagnoses in psychiatry, like bipolar, autism, obsessive compulsive, into different related spheres, or circles rather. The quantum field theory version I developed uses spheres because it's 4 dimensional. But the method I use for just simple modeling is 3 dimensional. So you have 3 circles. Well, in normal people, they're at right angles to each other on this sphere. But like in schizophrenia, the 2 of them are usually parallel. And that's simply, once again, referring to the fact that it's 2 things seen as 3, whereas 3 people respond normally. They perceive things in 3s and they respond in 3s. Incidentally, this is what Tesla meant by the number 6, is you can form a coupling state of 2s into 3s, resulting in 6s from thinking about something about a stimulus and a response, in the sense that this forms one collective whole thought. In the schizophrenic, you get a 5 dimensional vector, but in witchcraft, the number 5 means life values. So borrowing from that, we can see that schizophrenics are usually over-possessive, self-reporting about their life. They all think they're Jesus. This is another consequence of my theory that schizophrenics tend to over-focus on big things and under-focus on little things like getting a job and getting good grades and just making your way slowly towards something. It's a form of obsession, which is once again an attachment disorder. As I was saying earlier, there was a time when I thought that schizophrenia was only an attachment disorder. Apparently, it isn't. There was a time when I believed that phosphorus, lactin, and calcium were at fault for causing schizophrenia. It might be lactin. I'm might be calcium too. I'm a little unsure as to phosphorus. I used to think phosphorus because it's a 5 count for electron affinity, meaning that there is a way to account for 8 diseases through a phosphorus deficiency, because we report the it would spread the disease in 8 different ways. You have to think imaginative in quantum mechanics to see that, though. It has to do with things like the Pauli exclusion principle and the off-ball principle and molecular bonding. Once again, I would like to stress that this is all an integrated theory. You really shouldn't believe things that you hear unless you have good reason to. The fact that so many people seem to know so little about schizophrenia and have so many opinions about it is both dangerous, depressing, insulting, and strange, and ultimately sad, because people do not know what it is, and they insist on pushing down your throat the fact that you have to live off the government the rest of your life and things like that. It doesn't even appear to be the case. Using vibrators, pads, even light of a certain frequency would probably do the trick. You could watch a movie that was subliminally enhanced with light of a certain frequency. It would do the trick. That sort of thing is really very easy. That's another mistake psychiatrists often make. They often assume that schizophrenia is a subliminal disorder, meaning there's something lost in the subliminal mind. If that was true, you'd see things like random outbursts of anger and things like that when they discovered that something wasn't right, which is similar to hallucination. I can vaguely see why psychiatrists think that occasionally. It's really not the case, though, because you'd see it a lot more often than it happens. Moreover, you'd see it in all the schizophrenics, not just some of them. I believe the statistic goes is that half of schizophrenics hallucinate, which is actually a fairly big number as far as statistics go. It's certainly significant, but it's also not a comprehensive number, meaning that just because someone does or doesn't hallucinate, you should include them as schizophrenic. I guess that concludes my lecture for now. I just wanted to say that I do look at different forms of therapy, like Gestalt, holistic, uh, congestive, uh, Ben Holtz, um, living health, uh, Gestalt, Freudian, Neo-Freudian, about 40 different kinds of therapy. And I do a lot of work in the mathematics and physics of psychiatry, and I've applied this to psychology as well. The simple thing about the human brain that makes it so ingenious is that it's not defined in terms of symbols, if you know what I mean by that. If you use a computer, you'll find that they represent the alphabet by a series of digital bumps and beeps, like digital parts. Neural chains don't necessarily work that way. They respond to what something is physically, which has its own innate definition. In that sense, it's important to clarify that in physics, there's no need for symbols. You just respond to something for what it is. This is partly what allows for the speed and effectivity of neural cognition. Also, it's because I believe it is properly three-dimensional. That being said, it appears to have symbolic values which vary in 3 different ways: as a constant, a variable, and a topological variable, for instance, like something which we can turn into other things, transmute it, if you will. So it's fairly versatile and rapid, and the fact that the human brain is three-dimensional, it would really surprise me if neural cognition turned out to be digital. It really would, although neurocognists are fond of saying, well, a neuron is either transmitting or it isn't. But they forget about things like electrical potential and quantum thresholds and thresholds of energy activation and the fact that quantum mechanics is governed by three laws, you would also tend to think that neurocognition, since it's electromechanical, is governed by three laws. Indeed, there are only three laws of Newton, three forces in physics. Three is a perfect number, three factorial, three combinatorial, and three plus two plus one is always six. So there's things like that to consider. I'll elucidate more on that in my lecture on general physics and quantum unified theory. It's a more appropriate place for it. But for this lecture, I would like to say that there is hope for the schizophrenic candidate. The therapies would not be expensive. It would basically put the drug industry out of business overnight, something I'd very much like to see happen. Um, it doesn't appear to be particularly faulty either. You won't see people dying on like neuroleptic malignant syndrome where people just die of the drugs overnight. It's fairly fail-safe. There's vibrators. Consistently, I would say that schizophrenics can be harmed by vibrators if it's not handled correctly. You usually see it coming a good time in advance. Should have apt warning. Little things might get in the way, like a sensitivity spot or a psychological sensitivity to certain vibrations. For instance, if someone had been ritualistically tortured by their parents, for example, by vibrators in a car motor while they were driving to work or taking a vacation. My dad used to do that to me. I don't want to get into too much of what he is, but he's not a nice man. Um, like I said, it's important to understand modeling and heuristic modeling and aesthetic modeling and the modeling of logical sequences of thought and the restrictive model. A model should predict everything, anything, and absolutely comprehensively, and should predict nothing which doesn't exist. Should do everything, but also keep everything that happened from existing that doesn't occur in nature. So it should be a one-to-one map with reality, and it should be logically consistent. And then incidentally, this is probably a little bit more than you can ask from a theory of physical reality, because quantum mechanics itself doesn't appear to make a whole lot of sense, at least to a common observer. But thinking more constructively, a theory of schizophrenia is certainly evolvable from the principles of physics. For one thing, it takes place in the macro domain, which means that you won't see a lot of quantum effects taking hold. Admittedly, quantum mechanics plays a role in psychiatry, but except for little neurotic flimses of light, it's really not that noticeable. Ordinary life is more mechanical and electromagnetic than quantum mechanical. And yes, chemistry and organic chemistry is indeed quantum mechanical, but if you pick up an organic chemistry book, you won't find a whole lot of quantum mechanics in it anyway. So it really doesn't play a tremendous role. The fact that affect itself seems to be governed by the superstring physics is fascinating. The two-dimensional nature of the Feynman diagram being tubular instead of a line is indeed fascinating because it appears that the nerves were fashioned quantum mechanically by small oscillations, meaning that the ground and the earth and the water waves under the pressure of the moon were oscillating in a way that kept stirring things, meaning that the light and the sound that stimulated the ears and the eyes of the organisms before they even evolved into that quantum mechanically fixed them. Since it was inorganic, if you invert it quantum mechanically, it becomes organic. You have to use the Heisenberg uncertainty principle applied to life for that, organic versus inorganic. So if you spread the wave out, it's inorganic. If you make it precise, it's organic. That basically refers to what is known as immeasurable. They're studying this at MIT, but they haven't taken it as far as I have, to the point where they realize that the only reason eyes and ears are so highly evolved, which is a real big paradox in evolutionary theory, is simply because the wave motion forces it so quantum mechanically random, it becomes ordered, highly ordered. If you can understand such a thing like something being driven under a battery which moves in such a chaotic pattern, begins to invert itself. They've done that much work in the theory of thermodynamics in life systems. What they don't understand is how it applies to the eyes and ears, and the underlying theme behind the universe, that the universe has to make sense. Therefore, to a psychological perceiver, it has to make sense. Therefore, if it's just a fractal repeating itself, eventually it would repeat its own theme within itself and would repeat something that could understand what it was and how it worked. That's all that life is a fractal in three-dimensional space, or just sitter space, rather, four-dimensional space. And that's pretty much all I have to say this time. Uh, I guess in the next lectures I'll outline some of my theories of physics and applied physics to the situation of what schizophrenia is, and try to derive some principles for effective family therapy and social dynamic therapy, because certainly that is a need, and also because in doing ingenious things like having two counselors present at all times is actually fairly helpful, particularly if they're kind of different or very much the same. Um, I don't know. It's kind of strange because you wouldn't think something like that would work, but for me, it works fine. And I generally believe that you can make tremendous strides with therapy and vibrators and oscillators in electromagnetism, gravitational waves, optical waves, and sound waves, and light waves, and vibrators instead of using medication, just like these dopamine inhibitors. And psychiatrists don't often quote this in the courts, but dopamine is part of what accounts for the imaginative faculty of a human being and also the IQ. They say that people like Einstein and Bohr had high levels of dopamine in their body. I think this was even experimentally confirmed upon when they died. They had high levels of dopamine in their body. So it's really not a good thing to repress. Not only besides the fact you can catch pseudo-Parkinsonism from psychotropic usage, that and a whole lot of tics and EPS makes it very undesirable to be on those meds. Plus they make you tired all the time, make you want to sleep all day. Well, that's pretty much all that I have to say. You should just check out the theory for yourself. Try to work out some examples. I'm going to try to see if you can derive new conclusions from it. And things that aren't observed, you can disprove using the theory. Things that are observed, you can prove using the theory both ways. And just make sure it's consistent and self-contained and consistent with the rules of logic and reason. That's basically what it is. It's not a strange theory. Strange theory is something like mysticism or religion getting in the way. This theory is really very objective, very holistic, and conservatively pronounced. It's my attempt to change the world of psychiatry and win myself a Nobel Prize.